hearty welcome to one and all. This is episode 142 of the Confessions of a Not So Dangerous Mind podcast. I'd like to thank you all for joining me on this late Friday afternoon into early evening in New York. If you check out this episode on the YouTube channel or enjoying the content but haven't done so already, please click like, subscribe, comment, share, turn on those notifications. Or if you catch this episode on the audio platforms such as Spotify or iTunes, same general rule applies. Click like, subscribe, share, and turn on those notifications. So today marks 11 years since the world lost who I believe to be the greatest film critic who ever lived, Roger Ebert. Young people might know the name, might not know the name. I'm quite confident that if your parents were movie fans, they know Roger Ebert. They used to watch his TV show with also the late, great Gene Siskel. The art of film criticism, sadly, is a bit of a dying art, in my opinion, even with the incredible success of Rotten Tomatoes, Internet Movie Database, and now especially Letterboxd, which has been embraced by so many filmmakers, major filmmakers from Martin Scorsese on down. You love to see it. You love to see the interplay and interaction between artists, and consumers, many of whom have a lot to say about the movies which are coming out and have come out. But old school film criticism is what I'm referring to, not the ability of even someone like me who does have the degree that says I know what I'm talking about. This is why I kind of joke around, but I'm not entirely joking around when you see polls that discuss film experts say this. I'm in that category. That would be me. My diploma says that's what I did. I learned about history, culture, the movies that impacted cultures in different countries during different times throughout history. Roger Ebert was an academic, a Pulitzer Prize winner for film criticism, the only critic to ever win the Pulitzer for that. But he wrote for your average movie fan. He did not bombard readers with 180 IQ fuckery. And that was an issue I had with Pauline Kael, another all-time great critic. John Simon, who was a movie critic, was just an asshole, just trolling nonstop, dragging women for their looks, dragging men if they were a couple of pounds overweight. It looks like Denzel's put on weight. Hey, fuck you. What the hell does that have to do with anything? That's the kind of critic that John Simon was. So Roger Ebert wrote from the late 1960s until he passed in 2013, he wrote for the Chicago Sun-Times. You can't go deep on Roger Ebert without discussing Gene Siskel, who wrote for the Chicago Tribune. And the two of them had a TV show syndicated, and I think most of you know what syndication is all about. Maybe if you're under 20, the word doesn't ring a bell, or maybe 25. Basically, it means that the show was produced for a certain, and now we hear about series being in syndication like Seinfeld, but Siskel and Ebert was not specifically produced for a major network like an ABC, an NBC, a CBS. It was produced and it aired on affiliates around the country. So this was a TV show that had a huge reach. And it's difficult to quantify. And even some elder millennials won't get this or won't really understand because they didn't live it. Siskel and Ebert were major players in the movie industry simply by virtue of their TV show, not so much by the newspaper columns, because there were a ton of great critics who wrote columns. Guys like David Denby, who I absolutely adored, another great critic who wrote for New York Magazine. Pauline Kael wrote for The New Yorker. The TV show, though, being on, airing at a certain time on either a Friday or a Saturday for movies released that week, but then airing throughout the week, and you could always find them. You could find it on different networks and different channels. So if you happen to miss the first time it aired, you could always see it. So in brief, the TV show had Gene Siskel and Roger, and I should point out, Gene unfortunately was very young. He died of brain cancer. He was 52, going on 53. He was a guy who looked old when he was in his early to mid-30s because he lost all of his hair very young. But the two guys made an incredible team on the air. The way that they were often combative, just as often agreeing that a certain movie was great or was a sack of shit, but they were never less than compelling and must-see TV for the time. And a lot of people took their word for it because you didn't have this. You couldn't immediately check a movie. And sometimes you had a film and maybe you didn't get the newspaper that day, you didn't see what's good. You flip on Siskel and Ebert, and these are the 5 movies, and sometimes 4, that we're going to be reviewing this week. And their trademark was thumbs up or thumbs down. And some of their best TV was when one guy gave a movie thumbs up and the other guy gave it thumbs down. So as much as I identified more with Roger, I felt that Siskel was a bit of a crank. And even though Ebert famously could absolutely eviscerate a movie if he hated it, there was something about the way that he did it. When he loved a movie, when he hated a movie, even if we were in complete disagreement, and I would say that I disagreed with Siskel more than Ebert, but if we're being honest, I feel like I may have actually agreed with David Denby to a higher percentage than Roger, but I never got pissed off if Roger didn't like a movie that I thought was great. And there were various movies through history that Roger despised and or just didn't get that I thought were masterpieces. So what? I like to think that I'm enlightened enough where you could actually have a disagreement and not think, this person's a fucking asshole, piece of shit, fuck that dickhead. No. Because even in those times where we completely vehemently disagreed, and sometimes with Gene Siskel, Roger always elucidated his reasoning. And you could tell he had thought things through. In some cases, seeing a film more than once or multiple times when he would go through movies historically that he either loved or just didn't like. And I respected that. So as a kid, not only did I try to watch Siskel and Ebert, the program on television, because, without the internet, I had no means with which I didn't get the Chicago Sun-Times. I never read a print review of Roger Ebert's in the newspaper. I watched him on TV when I could, even though I didn't go to the movies a ton. But he was always on TV. He and Gene doing this. And they had some great arguments. And to be more precise, this movie right here, Blue Velvet, was the substance of not a nasty or, the sort of argument where one guy wanted to flip the other off the balcony, to their doom. But they had a very spirited argument about the merits of this film when it premiered. And it's exactly the kind of debate that Blue Velvet fostered at the time and continues. Although nowadays I would say it's less polarizing. More people who see it for the first time are like, holy fucking shit. Even if they don't exactly like it, they're like, okay, well, that was an experience in most cases. But Blue Velvet, David Lynch's, what I believe is his masterpiece. Some people will say Elephant Man, some people Eraserhead, Mulholland Drive. That's my movie. That's my David Lynch movie. It's, to me, top 5 greatest films in the history of cinema. That's how high esteem I hold this film. Roger fucking hated it. And he not only despised it, he thought the film didn't play fair with its secondary lead actress in Isabella Rossellini, and he left the movie theater angry. He left the movie theater so angry that if it had been an official premiere, I feel like he would have taken a swing at David Lynch. That is how offended he was and how he was really pissed off because he knew that David Lynch was a talented filmmaker, and he grew to really love and adore David Lynch over the years. The two of them had a kind of nice back and forth. Lynch even made jokes about, hey, 2 thumbs down from Siskel and Ebert. I want you to add that to the review. But Gene Siskel watched Blue Velvet and came away 25 years later saying, this is one of the best movies of this genre since Psycho, which was 25 plus years at that time. So Gene Siskel, Blue Velvet, hit the masterpiece button. Roger, 1 star. This movie made me feel bad. This movie does not play fair. And this is not any good at all. And I walked out frustrated, enraged, disappointed. David Lynch can do better. Hey, fuck you. This is his best movie ever. What the hell are you talking about? That's the best of film criticism, though, because Roger elucidated his points beautifully in his print review. If you see it, 1 star, and on TV. He and Gene could not have disagreed. They could not have been any further apart, but each guy explained how the movie worked or didn't work for them. You know, it's not about how the actress or actor feels. It's how the movie made me feel. That's how Roger explained himself. So that was one example of a movie. Not only the guys disagreed, but I vehemently disagree. And I will say Roger got that one wrong. He got that one way wrong. Other movies that Roger Ebert got wrong. He did not unabashedly love Full Metal Jacket. And I think Full Metal Jacket is the greatest war movie ever made. And he thought the film in the career of Stanley Kubrick was a big disappointment. He said, you can tell that Stanley knows what he's doing. His direction is fine. Story doesn't work for me. Well, you're fucking wrong. You're wrong, Roger. Got that one wrong. Dirty Dancing, he hated. Now, Dirty Dancing, he kind of came around on a little bit. But Dirty Dancing's a fucking great movie. He gave it 1 star upon release. 1 star. His problem was the title promised what he thought was a different movie. He thought there was going to be actual Dirty Dancing, and there really isn't that much. At least not enough for him. And that was a film where he was swimming upstream. And you look at his reviews, you say, Jesus, what movie did he watch? Now, there are very few films that Roger gave unabashed raves to that I didn't at least like a lot. There are plenty of, if you were to go through, and this is, again, something you can Google, why I love the internet, and every episode of Siskel and Ebert, the TV show, the quality varies, but you can literally find every single episode on the internet. Google, and if there's a movie you're curious about, a classic that you love from the 90s, from the 80s, from the 70s, you Google that movie, Siskel and Ebert, boom, it'll pop up. But before I just focus on Roger by himself, because as I say, Gene passed about 13, 14 years before Roger. There were those magical times where if anybody says, well, why were these guys popular? Why were they famous? I never liked them. There were times that they got movies exactly right, that they both did, and that they weren't jumping onto a bandwagon, but that they were the people who saw certain films on the front lines first, and their initial reactions were dead on accurate. And there's something to be said for that, because it's easy to hop on a bandwagon, but it's not so easy to make bold statements. And Siskel and Ebert, and I encourage you to look this up, they saw Goodfellas before it, was released. And Goodfellas was a film which I famously, on one of my earliest episodes on the channel here, talk about the fact that the pre-release, some of the screenings were disastrous, but more specifically, when Martin Scorsese showed the film to the executives at Warner, they were ready to take the film away from him, fire him, never work with him again. Marty, what the fuck did you do with our fucking money, you asshole? What the fuck is wrong with you? Luckily, Scorsese managed to convince them, think you got this wrong, guys. Let's screen it again. Let's see what happens. Take it to the New York Film Festival. I just think you guys got the wrong take, and I don't think those preview audiences were the right audiences. Whatever exactly was said. Siskel and Ebert, when they saw Goodfellas, before it hit the multiplexes, they both hit the masterpiece button. Boom. This is the best movie that Martin Scorsese has made. Bear in mind, Scorsese had already made Raging Bull. He had already made Taxi Driver. He had already made Mean Streets. He'd already made After Hours, which a lot of people thought was a masterpiece. The Color of Money. They were already calling Goodfellas his best film. They were already popping it up as the best film of 1990. They didn't have anybody behind them gently urging them, no, you got to put this movie up here. No, they were right at the front. That review might have been before any of the other major critics or anybody else filed theirs. They got that exactly right. And they were in lockstep. They both loved that movie. They both loved Chariots of Fire, too. Roger more so than Gene. Roger thought that Chariots of Fire was one of the best films he'd seen in years. And you could find his print review where he argues that. Gene liked it a lot, but whereas Roger had it as his number one film, I believe he had it, it ended up winning Best Picture for films released in 81. I believe Roger had it as his best film of that year. Gene had it in his top 10, but he was not quite as blown away as Roger. He loved it, but Roger's love for Chariots of Fire was on another level. Goodfellas, they were in lockstep. So I never met Roger Ebert, but I got to see him speak. And I don't mean this in a stupid way. It wasn't long after I saw him speak that he lost the power of speech because he developed mouth and jaw cancer, which unfortunately informed a lot of the last decade of his life, which is tragedy on top of everything else because he was such a great speaker. So my aunt took me to what amounted to it wasn't exactly a lecture. Roger was promoting his book, I Hated This Movie, which was a collection. And Roger did so much writing. He did so much writing. And I used to buy, every year he had a book that would come out, which was not freshly written, so to speak. It was a collection of reviews that he had already filed over like the previous 15 years, maybe even 20 years. So like, let's say 1989, you would have a soft cover book that was simply a collection of reviews that he had written, let's say since the late 60s up until 1988 or whatever the exact year was, and interviews that he did with major filmmakers, actors of the day, sometimes discussing controversial films, maybe Martin Scorsese, Last Temptation of Christ, but they were just collections. It's not like he wrote new material for these books, but I bought two of them. Roger Ebert's Movie Home Companion, and I read them cover to cover multiple times. I just loved the way he wrote, and in many cases, movies that I was able to then watch on Cinemax or HBO or Showtime when they aired that I wouldn't have found out about if not for Roger, because there was no internet. In 1989 or 1990 or 1991, there were movies that I had maybe kind of heard of, but until reading Roger's review, oh, wait a minute, that movie that Ebert gave 4 stars is on Cinemax at 3 p.m. I'm going to watch it. The youngins, it's difficult for you to kind of put that through the mental meat grinder and understand what I'm saying. You know the words, but it's not something you experience. It's difficult to put yourself into the shoes of somebody who would be really excited. Oh my God, it's on TV today. Wow. It happened more than you would think. So when I saw Roger at this book event for I Hated This Movie. And this, again, was not anything that he had written specifically for a book. These were Ebert's no stars and in some cases 1-star reviews that were collected and put into book form. And he had another one, though, just to show that he was not a crank. He had another one called Roger Ebert's The Great Movies, which was a collection of 4-star reviews and movies that he considered some of the greatest works of cinema. So there was always the balance. But Roger was great when he loved a movie, but he was funny as fuck when he hated a movie. And the title of that book came from his review, and it's also a movie that Gene Siskel despised, a film that's now 30 years old. Rob Reiner, unfortunately, his darkest hour, because I love Rob Reiner, Princess Bride, among so many other great films, When Harry Met Sally. Rob Reiner made the movie North with a young Elijah Wood and Bruce Willis among a tremendous all-star cast, but the film is terrible. There's not one good idea in it. And Ebert, as he and Gene were going over the review, he said in his print review, I hated this movie. Hated every simpering second of it. And that was the title of the book that he was talking about for the first half hour of this particular event, where he was on stage probably about 3 hours. But it turned into a Q&A, which I loved. Now, I didn't get to ask a question. I didn't really know that they were going to do that, so it's not like I was prepared to start waving my hand around. But this was the summer of 2003, so now more than 2 decades ago. And Roger told so many incredible stories of his travels across the country, meeting certain actors, and a lot of stories that I hadn't heard or read that had not been published. He told a story of meeting John Candy in New York by chance, that they were, Candy was promoting, I think he was at the New York premiere of Planes, Trains, and Automobiles, and Roger may have been in town to go on with Johnny Carson or Letterman or something like that. But it's not something that had been reported. And he told a story. He was at presumably a really nice hotel like this Waldorf or something like that. And he went down to the bar. He had just gotten to town and he wanted to have a little food. And he went to the bar and he saw John Candy sitting there by himself and he was flabbergasted. And just the way Roger told the story of his chance meeting, and the guys knew each other and he was a huge fan of John Candy. But that's a story that he hadn't told in book form, because he didn't interview him. He and John Candy just shared a meal, shared laughs, shared stories from the actor-comedian perspective, from the film critic who has traveled the globe, even to Cannes perspective. It was fucking incredible. So Roger had us laughing constantly, and he was just so good. He could have been a stand-up comic. So when he took questions, a number of the questions were about movies I've already mentioned, people saying, why didn't you like this? Why didn't you like this? How did you like that? This movie's a piece of shit. And he was never less than gracious. He didn't rag on anybody. And one of the highlights, a woman raised her hand, and Roger, yes, the young lady in the 6th row or whatever it was, she said, Roger, don't get mad at me. People start giggling already. I've seen A Clockwork Orange 3 times. People keep telling me this is the greatest movie ever made or one of the greatest. I don't get it. What's wrong with me, Roger? Giggle, giggle, giggle. Now, I knew what Roger was going to say because I had read his review of A Clockwork Orange. Didn't like it. Roger said, I don't get it either. And when I tell you, the audience in that auditorium at Rockefeller University roared, even though most of the people who were roaring were people like me, who were like, Roger, you got that one wrong. Lady, you don't know what the fuck you're talking about. But the way he said it, the way he was connecting with this person, and he was not lying, because if you Google, he did not like A Clockwork Orange. In the same manner, he thought that Full Metal Jacket didn't do enough, that it didn't do as much with the premise as it should have. My favorite movie, though, that Roger absolutely disliked, because Full Metal Jacket, you could say he kind of was a modified thumbs up. It just should have been better. And A Clockwork Orange, he never told people not to see it. He just didn't get why everybody was doing cartwheels and why there were people saying, this is Kubrick's best film, Raj. What movie did you see? Because there are a lot of major critics of that time that would say, Clockwork Orange, best film of the 70s. Number one, this is the best movie of the 70s. And Roger was just like, I don't know what you're talking about. Whatever. But the movie that he did not like and didn't even give like one of these modified, well, kind of thumbs up, thumbs down, he just flat out disliked, is The Natural, a movie I just talked about on the channel in the one of the most underrated performances series, Robert Redford in the main character. Roger read the book and did not like the movie. It bothered him that the movie did not make any attempt to be realistic. It was simply telling a fairy tale, a fable, an Arthurian legend story, and he felt the movie was lazy and slack and should have been better. He was completely fucking wrong on that. Natural is easily a top 5 greatest sports movies of all time, maybe even top 3. But if you read his review, he explains again so beautifully why the movie didn't work for him. Hey, I respect that. It didn't make me love Roger Ebert's criticism and be as much of a fan of him as I was. any less because he was sincere. You never got the sense that Roger was saying something well, there were no clicks, but just to get people to tune into the TV show maybe. Like I never felt that he and Gene argued because they wanted more eyeballs to the sets. We're getting plenty of viewership. That show was money. It was so good. The Crying Game, where I think Gene Siskel famously gave away the secret to the crying game, and Roger looked like he wanted to stuff the guy into a garbage can. That was one thing with Roger, although there are spoiler-ish elements in all of his reviews if it's movies with big twists. He didn't like to give away big plot twists. He didn't like to give away major character reveals. He was very cautious because he was a movie fan and he didn't want movies to be spoiled. So he was very careful, and he would often say in the review, and I try to do the same thing sometimes when I speak to you guys, he would say things like, I'm going to tread very carefully so that I don't ruin the experience for you, because he wanted people to love movies. Even if they were movies that he was lukewarm on, he still respected them and wanted you to enjoy it as much as possible. The last thing he wanted was to blow the ending of The Sixth Sense. Didn't want to do that. Roy Hobbs hits a home run did not want to do that. He wanted people to discover the films for themselves. And he certainly wasn't angry when somebody said, Roger, how the fuck did you not like Dirty Dancing? That got more laughs. Dirty Dancing's my favorite movie of all time. That's fine. It just didn't work for me. But he did indicate that day he may have come around on Dirty Dancing to where he would recommend people to see it. When he saw it the first time, it didn't work for him. He left the theater pissed off because he thought he was promised a different movie than he got. Now, one film, though, that Roger famously came around on in a different sense. So he and Gene reviewed Unforgiven, the Clint Eastwood Western, which is now more than 3 decades old, which ended up winning a lot of Oscars, was nominated for a lot of Oscars, and it won Best Picture and Director for Clint. Now, Gene Siskel, incredibly, thumbs down. Unbelievably. And Gene was not anti-Clint Eastwood. As absurd as it seems, there were certain critics, like Judith Crist, and for a long time, until he came around and more or less apologized, Rex Reed, who was a big critic of the day, did not like Clint Eastwood. He hated most of Clint's movies. Gene Siskel was not a troll. He adored Clint. He was a big Clint fan going back to the 70s. He just, Unforgiven, he didn't think it was good. He gave it a thumbs down. Now they argued, and this is a review you can find. Roger was angry that Gene was not giving it a thumbs up. He said, Gene, just for the professionalism, just for Richard Harris, for Hackman, you're telling me that you didn't get anything from these performances? The immaculate way that Eastwood set the time period? That's not enough for you to at least say, I think people should see it? No. So Roger apparently had problems with it, but it was an easy thumbs up for him. But then a couple of months later, he watched the movie again, and he was dazzled and suddenly realized, I misjudged this. He didn't say anything about Gene. He didn't want to drag his partner. But he said, I misjudged this. And he believed that it was the best film of 1992. He had been going through a lot of personal turmoil. He got married. There were some other things that had happened in his life. And he said, I don't think I had my full attention on the film, and I missed a lot of what Eastwood did here. And I kind of slept on some of the extraordinary performances from Gene Hackman, from Morgan, from Richard Harris, even from the kid, James Woolvett. And so he filed a new review and gave the film 4 stars. He was willing to shift his perception and change his mind. He was not locked into one preset, and that's the way that it always had to be. And it was another thing that I loved about him, that sometimes he would say, got this one wrong. As when he appeared and spoke amazingly, incredibly, for 2 hours plus at Rockefeller University that day. But I should point out another short that I saw. This was about Roger and a little bit about Gene, but my sense was more about Roger. And it's from not that long ago. It was a round table of comic actors, including Sacha Baron Cohen and Jim Carrey. Now, I am an unabashed, avowed fan of Jim Carrey's, his stand-up comedy, which is insane, but his film work, even though he's made a lot of shitty movies. I didn't like Fun with Dick and Jane. There are a lot of movies that Bruce Almighty was okay. There are a lot of movies that Jim made that are not great. but there are those which are. And Jim Carrey tells a story of when Siskel and Ebert's review for Ace Ventura: Pet Detective, that's now more than 30 years old, that movie, when it hit, Jim's agents thought, you're not going to get the roles that you were up for. Siskel and Ebert just didn't like the movie and they couldn't understand what the fuck you were doing, or words to that effect. And you think the story is going in a different direction. You think that Jim is going to trash film critics or trash Siskel and Ebert. But he's simply setting us up for a surprise. And Jim basically says they didn't like it. The movie ended up being a huge hit anyway. He said, but by the time The Truman Show came out, they did an entire episode on me. Well, by that point, Gene's health was starting to go, unfortunately, and it was Roger. But he said, they did a whole episode on me called Jim Carrey, Clown with Class. And they were huge fans of The Truman Show and what I tried to do in the movie and how the film came across. And then Jim starts tearing up because he knows both guys are gone. And he said, they said they were wrong. They said they were wrong. And honestly, most critics don't really do that. Most people in general don't admit we got this one wrong. But Roger in particular said words to the effect of, I didn't know what I was seeing. He didn't know what he was seeing. He didn't get that he was watching a generational talent in real time become a star in Jim Carrey and Ace Ventura. And by the time The Truman Show hit, a little over 4 years later, it was understood this is a Da Vinci of comedy, and he's a damn good film actor. And Roger Ebert of Truman Show and Siskel too, they both masterpiece button in their top 5. They would have had no trouble if that had ended up winning Best Picture. That's how much they loved that movie. And both of them were rapturous in their praise for Jim's performance. I encourage you to look up that short. You know, Jim Carrey, for all the laughs, when he gets emotional, it means something. And him tearing up, thinking of Siskel and Ebert, guys that he probably hated their guts in the Ace Ventura, when it first came out. But then he came to appreciate and adore them too. And the fact that they were willing to throw themselves at the mercy of people and say, we fucked up. This guy is great. We should not have been so dismissive. We just didn't know what we were seeing. The fact that Roger was able to form different conclusions, to come around on certain films that didn't hit him right the first time. The fact that he also didn't on others, but he gave them a chance. Like what he said about Clockwork Orange. Every couple of years, I watch it again to see if it changed for me. And as of 2003, it hadn't. He still thought the film was trash. It just doesn't work. I don't know what everybody's talking about. Giggle, giggle, giggle. But Roger Ebert, my favorite film critic, as much as I love Denby is still around. He's a great critic. Wrote a little bit more intellectual than Roger. Doesn't mean he was smarter, but he was a guy who would occasionally show off and he would flex the intellectual muscle. I never once felt that Roger was doing that. But as quaint as this is, Roger Ebert was a big factor in my appreciation of and love for movies. Watching his reviews on TV, the passionate way that he defended films he loved and trashed films he hated. But recommendations for movies I would not have otherwise seen, and reading his books. I think I read a total of 5 from I Hated This Movies, Roger Ebert's Book of Film, and all of those Roger Ebert movie companion books that he was putting out one a year. I was saddened when his health took a turn for the worse, when he lost the power of speech. Oh, and I should point out his greatest outlier moment as a critic. Dark City, #1 movie of 1998. He had The Truman Show in his top 5, but he had Dark City ahead of Saving Private Ryan, The Truman Show, and the eventual Best Picture Oscar winner, Shakespeare in Love. Dark City was on my list of the best movies you've never seen, even though many of you have seen it. For that alone, the fact that Roger was willing to swim so far upstream for what he considered the greatest science fiction film this side of 2001: A Space Odyssey, and for him it maybe was the greatest science fiction film he'd ever seen. But Roger Ebert was only 70 when he passed. and his legacy of film criticism and of humor. So many funny things. I just talked about today in a short that when he saw the 1997 film, Hollywood goes in cycles. They make 2 movies about comets and meteors in 1998 in Deep Impact and Armageddon. The previous year, 1997, he had 2 volcano movies. Dante's Peak with Linda Hamilton and Pierce Brosnan, and then Volcano with Tommy Lee Jones and Anne Heche. The problem with Volcano, and I'm going to end on this, the problem with Volcano is that there was no volcano. It was all below ground. It seemed as if the volcano was attacking by coming through people's sinks. I'm not really exaggerating. And Roger Ebert, again, felt that he was promised a different movie. And as he famously said, it's one of the greatest quotes ever uttered, forget by a critic on a movie, it's one of the greatest quotes, period. He said they advertised the movie by saying the coast is toast, but that's not correct. In this movie, the volcano is Drano. The volcano is Drano. Roger Ebert, the greatest film critic who ever lived, gone 11 years today. Thanks for tuning in to episode 142 of the Confessions of a Dangerous Mind podcast. I'd like to thank you all so much for joining me for this different episode. And I understand a lot of you youngins have never heard of Roger Ebert, but I encourage you to seek him out, to Google him. He was the man. He was the best there ever was at film criticism. But if you caught this episode on the YouTube channel and haven't done so already, please click like, subscribe, comment, share, turn on those notifications. Or if you end up catching this episode on the audio platforms such as Spotify or iTunes, same general rule applies. Click like, subscribe, share, and turn on those notifications. I'll be back with episode 143 real soon. Till then, peace.